Hi, everyone. I'm Adrienne LaFrance, the Atlantic's executive editor. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm joined today with Joshua Geltzer, a senior director for counterterrorism at the NSC, now teaching at Georgetown Law, and Bret Schafer, fellow for disinformation at the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here with me. And today we're going to talk about domestic extremism in the United States and how it has been fueled by the growth of conspiracy theories, including movements like QAnon. Also, how these same channels for disinformation are used by foreign actors trying to sow chaos in the United States. So lots to touch on here in the aftermath of a very chaotic and sort of still shaking out election in terms of the political response, and certainly in terms of the disinformation. So I wanted to start there, actually, looking at social platforms in this moment. And I'm curious to hear from both of you, maybe starting with you, Josh, about what we've seen social platforms like Twitter and Facebook do in terms of trying to curb disinformation in the past 4 weeks, and how that's different than what we've seen in the past 4 years. What's changed?
And let me just begin by thanking Global Security Forum and all the great folks at the Soufan Center for the chance to be part of this great conversation with both of you, which I've really been looking forward to. So I do think we saw the leading social media companies and other communications platforms almost girding for battle as the 2020 election unfolded in a way that we didn't see in 2016. I think even the companies would admit that 2016 caught them a bit flat-footed. Hindsight may have revealed just how flat-footed it was. 2020, there was a sense that the challenges would be there, but I think the types of challenges nonetheless brought certain surprises. So you did see in particular companies like Facebook and Twitter looking for what they sometimes call coordinated inauthentic behavior. That's Facebook's term. Things that are going viral, not because they're organically viral, but because a deliberate operation, really an intelligence services influence operation, has made it so and has worked hard to leverage certain tools to make it so. They tried to catch those. They tried to catch them sooner rather than later, though they often had spread to many users, because that's the virality of these platforms, even before they were caught. And they tried to identify it, to out it in a sense publicly, in the hope that being armed or being warned is being armed, that if Americans know this stuff is being foisted upon them, maybe they're a bit better placed to discount it, and avoid sharing it further themselves. And I think with respect to foreign governments, there was some greater success. I think with respect to one particular topic area, disinformation about when to vote, how to vote, whether one could still vote, there was a deliberate effort. But, and I'll say one more thing, and then I'm sure we'll come back to all of this in the course of the conversation. I think one thing that cropped up in the 2020 cycle, for which we will look back and say there is still a lot more work to be done, is when the source of disinformation comes from within. When it's domestic rather than foreign, when it's official government actors, and when they are deliberately spreading things that I think we can fairly call lies about the electoral system, how it works, and what it has yielded. And that seems to be the big challenge of 2020. And I think it's fair to say there wasn't sufficient preparation, because a lot of lies are spreading quite rampantly as we speak.
Well, and I want to go back to this sort of targeted approach in terms of what these platforms focused on. But I also first want to just kind of put a broad question to Bret, which is, what do you think took them so long? I mean, you're right, Josh, that there was this 2016 wake-up call. Why did it take four full years for us to get to a point where an obvious lie was being called out?
Well, I think in some ways elections are one of the easier things for the platforms to moderate, because they can fall back on their civic integrity, protocols that they have in place. So they have made a concerted effort for years to focus on the election. I mean, one of the things we have tried to stress over the last 4 years is disinformation is not just about elections. And in fact, even if the ultimate kind of goal is to influence to some degree the outcome of an election, that's a process that takes a very, very long time. It just doesn't pop up the day of an election or 2 days before. That you really have to look at this as sort of a continuous thing that starts chipping away at people's sort of faith in democratic processes, their faith in sort of objective facts and things like that. So it's somewhat concerning that there's always this push at just looking at this very sort of discrete time period around an election. Because of course, if you go back to what Russia did in 2016, that was years in the making when they had these accounts and assets that popped up and started to integrate themselves into American conversations and sort of slowly sort of manipulate them from within. So to answer your question about why it took them this long, I mean, I think just because the election was such a pivotal event, and it was in some ways easier for them to focus on an election rather than just conversations day in, day out. I think what we saw, though, is that in many ways, their efforts kind of backfired. I mean, they didn't really work. And as Josh kind of laid out, where this kind of leaves us right now is we saw in the last 4 weeks probably the most aggressive moderation in the history of social media companies. And still, this was probably the greatest disinformation event in the history of social media. So what that leaves you with is either their efforts are just completely ineffective, or that we have to be looking at solutions that don't rely on Facebook and Twitter to moderate our way out of this mess. Because the point Josh made that we just really don't have an answer for is what happens when disinformation starts with a genuine American who has a large organic following. The platforms just don't have an answer for that. I frankly don't have an answer for that, because everything we pushed them towards was to try to make conversations more authentic, to root out bots, to root out all of the sort of manipulative techniques that were used to sort of create this illusion of authenticity, to manufacture consensus. But if you have an account that has 10 million followers, and that account is sort of the super spreader of disinformation, they have no way of quarantining it. And we saw them try with the New York Post story, and it just completely failed. And so I think the challenge going forward is, how do we address that problem? Because then you're getting into efforts to try to censor oftentimes real Americans, American outlets, and you have to do it so quickly to have any impact that I just don't know. I don't know how we deal with that problem. That's, I think, the sort of lasting takeaway from what we saw during this election cycle.
Well, and adding complexity, of course, and one of the major sources of disinformation is the president of the United States. And then there's this whole newsworthiness component where, I think people reasonably want to have easy access to what the president is saying, but also without there being harm caused. The other thing I've been thinking about with regard to President Trump is the extent to which even, people have floated this idea of whether he should be removed from Twitter once he's a private citizen, or some have argued sooner, but that even if he were to be deplatformed, that his audience would still find him. And so, to me, there's always this line between how much is performative, like we're doing this big splashy thing to address the thing people are upset about, versus how much actually changes our informational environment in a healthy way. I'm curious at what you two think about whether the president should be allowed to be on Twitter. Josh, you're first.
I'm happy to start, and I'll maybe start at a slightly more generalized level, which is this deplatforming question, which is, does taking someone or some set of actors who are repeat offenders, spreading disinformation, harmful disinformation, sometimes that could even lead to violence, does taking them off a platform help? And I think from somebody who used to work on counterterrorism, the answer was it was never a silver bullet solution. But did it help? Yes, because what terrorists, especially terrorists who are trying to reach often from abroad into a domestic population and incite violence, they need new audience members. They need people who might be vulnerable to their siren call and then go down a road of radicalization that leads to violence. And can those terrorists then pop up on V Concocte? Can they pop up on enclosed chat rooms that are end-to-end encrypted? Yes, they can. They're not gone from spreading disinformation, or sometimes it's not a matter of disinformation with terrorists. It's just incitement to violence. It's not so much about falsity or truth as encouraging unlawful, awful things. But not having them in a place where they can find new followers and find new individuals who might be susceptible to their call, that still seemed like progress. It wasn't the end of things of progress. Here's the problem then when we talk about somebody like President Trump. He has already built such an astonishingly large following that you worry about what it means to have that person removed, because a lot of those followers will find that person wherever they pop up next, whatever platform. And there are platforms, as you both know, that have said there are no rules here. Essentially, anyone can have this as their platform. And what does it add to their almost martyr-like status, their mythos, that they can say those powerful tried to silence us, which is, of course, what President Trump has already said. He already claims that his follower count is being unfairly cut. He claims that he and his allies suffer unfair content moderation. It reminds me a bit of what he said early on to a member of the media. He says, the reason I always attack you all is so that nobody believes you when you report on things, even if they're true, being the subtext. And here, I think he's beat up on the platform so much that if they were to remove him, he has laid the groundwork for characterizing that in a way that, in a sense, increases his message, or at least gives it life in new form. So it's not a clear answer to your yes or no question, but I think it shows the complexity of having, in a sense, enabled Trump to have the audience he now has. It's very hard to deal with at this point.
And you also see like these other platforms like Gab, for example, lumping together mainstream media with big tech as a sort of like force working together, which of course doesn't reflect reality. But Bret, what about you? Do you think the president should be allowed on Twitter?
Well, before getting that, I would say that's also RT and Sputnik's narrative, is lumping the corporate media with big tech, with the elites. Like it's all part of this sort of grand conspiracy. But going back to the question, and I would again just echo Josh's point, I think deplatforming works, but it needs to work very early in the process of building an audience. So QAnon, I think QAnon could have been snuffed out and should have been snuffed out, but that needed to happen in 2017 when we started to see it really taking root. And if you would have done that then, there's no way QAnon would be what it is today, because it needed a space like Facebook that has kind of a large enough general audience to continue to gain followers. As Josh laid out, if you have the president, if you have another sort of key figure like Alex Jones, they have enough of a following at this point that when they move to another platform, they bring that audience with them. Maybe not all of them, but enough of them to continue to have a voice. So what we saw in the last week, for example, is we saw this movement for conservatives to leave Facebook and Twitter and go to Parler. So, now this is something that's not just happening in kind of the radical fringes of the internet, where we saw this, again, back in 2017, as soon as Twitter started taking more aggressive action, we saw a movement to push people onto Gab. But that was sort of in the white nationalist community and the sort of Russian troll community. Now this is, my aunt and uncle that are moving to Parler. So that, I think, is the danger of deplatforming somebody who already has a platform. I'm not against deplatforming. I think it does work, but it's got to work really early in the process of audience building, because once there is an organic audience there, they'll take that audience somewhere else. And frankly, it's probably going to be more destructive in a place that, is not policed. There's not sort of other voices out there that are pushing back against it. So I think deplatforming Trump now, I think that would be detrimental, frankly.
It's really interesting. You mentioned the risk of taking an audience to a place that's more detrimental, because I've thought about this a lot in the context of Facebook, that, the way that Facebook describes itself as a community and as a force for a more open world, and like pick your other sort of sunny sounding way of characterizing Facebook. And yet we see very practically the real world harm that can be caused by disinformation on Facebook, specifically on other platforms, which we'll also get to. And so I've found myself at times wondering, like, would it be better for humanity if we just had platforms that weren't so sort of like secretly algorithmically determined in terms of what people see, and not pushing QAnon or whatever other conspiracy theory of the day is spreading like wildfire across them? And it brings you to the question of sort of like an 8kun type platform, which is the successor to 4chan, which folks are probably familiar with. And objectively, the content on 8kun is reprehensible. I mean, it's really awful. And yet it's all user generated. So the community is just plainly what the people there are there to talk about. And I've found myself sort of wondering, like, which is actually more harmful? A community of like terrible misogynists posting racist, hateful things, objectively bad, or a community that sort of bills itself as being a force for good, when in fact there's some really insidious, nefarious things taking place there. And is that even the right way to think about like Apecoon versus Facebook? I'm really curious for both of your views on that.
What a dreadful set of choices when you frame it that way, Adrienne. But it's a great and fascinating question, because the idea of a free-for-all sounds really bad until you see what the purportedly moderated and curated set of platforms is yielding, and it doesn't have the kind of visceral horrors of some of what they remove, and which their algorithms have gotten better and better at removing, or at least flagging for humans to remove quickly. But there's really insidious stuff that isn't just graphically violent or otherwise on its face bad, but when it's, for example, as you've written about, when it's QAnon and it's really changing how Americans think about themselves, their government, law, it may not be, blood on screen, but it can really do a lot of damage. Now, I guess in a world in which the big platforms are, in a sense, they appear here to stay, and in which something other than a free-for-all seems essential to their economic model, I think what at least a lot of us hold out hope could make it better and be feasible is some transparency with respect to those algorithms, some sense that researchers like Bret and others, if they could have better access to it, might help the companies themselves, the rest of us, government, understand why some of the stuff that proves so dangerous and harmful spreads as quickly as it does. And maybe if companies had the benefit of all that input and frankly pressure to alter that in various ways, you could have, I won't call it the best of both worlds, but at least less bad set of options than the two you laid out, Adrienne.
And I want to go in a second, Bret, to you about algorithms. But before I do that, I'm curious, Josh, from a counterterrorism perspective, which, again, two terrible choices I'm laying out here, but which is more desirable in terms of like, is it easier for law enforcement to find people who are planning really harmful, terrorist attacks, whatever it may be, domestic extremism? Is it preferable to have it centralized to a big mainstream platform like Facebook versus these little corners, sort of dark corners of the internet? Or I'm just sort of curious from a counterterrorism perspective, which keeps us safer? Like which version of the internet is safer for everybody?
Having terrorist content, their recruitment, propaganda material sit on the major platforms, even if that meant that they didn't try as aggressively to have very graphic stuff once the platforms became better at pleasing, was still really dangerous, because what we found in government and what researchers have documented is that it's not just the graphic stuff that brings people in to the terrorist world. In fact, it's often stuff that one researcher, Sir Charlie Winter, has called the theme of warmth, of community, of belonging. So it's videos that on their face don't appear awful. They are terrorist content, to be sure, but they would show ISIS's attempt at a marketplace, showing different, almost cosmopolitan gatherings, different foods being brought into a place like Raqqa, Syria, and being cooked by those who've joined this purported caliphate they've been built. And the appeal of those could be as damaging, could be as great, could be what draws in someone who says, well, this is not what I thought ISIS was all about based on mainstream media reporting. I'd like to learn more. And then those other types of content fill out their sense of the group and fill out their sense of what the group might want them to do, such as joining them on the battlefield or engaging in violence. So even that stuff that's on its face, maybe harder to detect, but reaches a wider audience, we really were worried about it in the counterterrorism community.
Well, and that goes to a point you were making earlier, Bret, about these sort of like already well-grooved channels for disinformation. I mean, I certainly think of QAnon in this category just because of its sprawling nature. You can kind of like plop any conspiracy theory you want into a QAnon group and find a receptive audience. But Bret, I'm curious for your views on sort of which channels are most pronounced. And on the platform, certainly we know that the major platforms with huge audiences are the places where these channels get established. But are there things you're noticing about how sort of channels used for disinformation are then repurposed or reimagined and their sort of staying power?
Well, to go back to something Josh said that I think is important to kind of address that question, like I think the real concern is less of the extreme for people who are already radicalized and the edges of the extreme, and what the algorithms and the way platforms are organized do to push people to one side or the other. And that, I think, is the real challenge of leaving some of the more problematic content up on YouTube or Facebook. Is, the extreme is going to find the extreme content, and they're going to find those communities. What we're concerned about are those 15, 20% who maybe dip their toes in the water and get sort of pushed headfirst into the lake of conspiracy and hate speech and all the other nonsense. And so I think that goes back to how platforms are organized, how content is presented in front of people, but also, to address your question of really thinking through, how do we want these platforms to look, and how bad actors are trying to basically play with the architecture of the sites and build into their kind of organization of how to move people around, not only the individual platform, but off platform from the start. That's now baked into the strategy. So what we saw this week with the Stop the Steal movement on Facebook, that group was gaining, I'm going to screw up the numbers here, but like 1,000 new followers every minute kind of thing. And what they had sort of built in from the beginning is, we are going to be shut down at some point. We know Facebook is going to moderate this. So they had set up alternative websites. They had set up funding mechanisms through these sort of charitable donation kind of apps and widgets, so that now when we see these movements start on larger platforms, they kind of know that their time is limited, so that they have built alternative channels, so that they have all of these kind of tentacles out there, so that if one gets cut off, they already have the way of kind of redirecting people to different parts of the ecosystem. And so it's like, as we get better at dealing with the problem and understanding how disinformation propagates and how recruitment happens, the bad actors are also getting better, and they're kind of building into their plans from the beginning of how to move people around once platforms start taking a more aggressive approach. And then it's also built into the narrative of it, of like, look, we told you that big tech was going to censor us, and they did. So now, let's keep the movement going on this other platform. And so I think it's important to think of the whole thing as an ecosystem, because different platforms have different purposes. Some in a sort of technical way of like, YouTube is going to host a video that gets spread through Twitter that then is, housed in communities on Facebook, but also of how to move people once the platforms start taking action, and to have different communities set up so you keep the movement alive.
Well, and what you're saying also really sort of elucidates the need for these large tech companies to be, clearly they need to operate independently by their own values, but also like, if one major platform has like the world's most transparent algorithm, that's all well and good. But if people are setting up huge organic audiences across different platforms, it only does so much, basically.
And the platforms have gotten a lot better about communicating amongst one another some of these big threats. So Facebook, Twitter, Google, when we started looking at this problem 3 years ago, we would see one of them take action against a certain community, and then they would have links to their sort of alternative channels that just wouldn't be touched for a very long time. There was just no coordination there of Twitter saying, hey, we're finding this thing, it looks to be a Russian troll community. Facebook, you probably want to deal with the channels that are also on your platform. So they've gotten much better, if you're looking at the big three, maybe include Reddit and a few others. Where they're limited is bringing the small and medium-sized platforms into the fold, where a lot of this stuff starts bubbling up, or as I mentioned, gets pushed off to. And the reason they can't bring them in the fold is many of them are set up explicitly to kind of house some of this bad behavior. So they can't bring the trust and safety person, I don't think exists, but if it did for 4chan or Acun, into some of these Facebook decisions of, hey, we've got this community here that's problematic, because Acun would say, great, let's try to foster that community. So I think that's a problem, is figuring out how the platforms communicate amongst one another, especially since some of them, as we've discussed, are set up with the purpose of being a home to people who are deplatformed.
Right. Well, and it doesn't help either that they're economically competitive with one another. Speaking of the economics of it, I'm curious for your views about, we've talked a little bit about algorithmic transparency, but knowing that and I'll focus on Facebook just because it's an easy and salient example, but like knowing that the way that Facebook makes its money is off of being able to match the right ads with the right users, and determining what users see which ads requires the data that the users are putting into the system, and that some degree of opacity actually helps them have a strong case for their model being special and for their audience being huge. Is there any way to, like, to me, the need for algorithmic transparency may be directly at odds with Facebook's economic incentives. So what do we do? What should be done? What should the algorithmic transparency look like? And how do we get there is another way of asking that.
Well, to start with, I don't think you can have full transparency in the sense of like, this is just made public and anyone can see it, because as we know, that then gives a roadmap for bad actors to exploit it. That said, I mean, there are many different industries that have to be transparent with independent third-party regulators, where it's not just that they're like, banks are not publishing everything that they have to give to certain regulators. You can do that with an independent outside group having the ability to look under the hood. That doesn't mean Google has to all of a sudden sort of publish, which frankly wouldn't be all that helpful because it'd be too complicated for most people to understand their full sort of algorithmic.
Or you'd be looking at like computer code.
Exactly. So there just has to be an independent audit of the companies. It doesn't mean they have to be fully publicly transparent. And of course, as you mentioned, that is their business model. Like, the reason people go to Google is Google generally works better as a search engine than Bing. So to be forced to just release like how the special sauce is made, would be problematic. But I think it also goes back to the first point that you made about advertisers. There needs to be a lot of work in terms of looking at the ad ecosystem and the amount of fraud that's happening there, and how much disinformation is financed unwittingly by advertisers because they have no insight whatsoever into where their ads are placed. So if we look off of Facebook and off of YouTube and just look at sort of the website ecosystem and how ad tech works, most responsible advertisers do not want their brand to appear on a white nationalist site. And, there are checks in place that should keep that from happening, but it happens all the time. And advertisers just don't know. I mean, they have no more ability to know where their ads are placed than like a sleeping giant or the groups that try to pressure companies to place ads with more responsible advertisers. But I think the advertising ecosystem is something we have not paid enough attention to. And if you got to the ad fraud problem and how much of this is really for profit, I mean, even QAnon, where like the start of QAnon clearly was politically motivated, but now it's just filled with a bunch of grifters selling Q merchandise. So if you are able to kind of wipe out the financial incentives, you at least shrink the problem, and you don't get rid of the problem clearly, but focusing on the money and how these sites are monetized, that would do a world of good for at least, minimizing the problem, if not eliminating it.
Josh, I'm curious for your views on one of the things I've sort of probably naively found myself thinking about over the years is the extent to which, like, maybe some really smart entrepreneur will just come along and make a better social platform, or, disrupt Amazon in some interesting way. And I'm curious for your views on, have we reached the point where like regulation is the only way to begin to solve this problem, or is there some other force by which we could make a better internet that doesn't require government intervention?
It's worth remembering that the way Facebook kind of knocked out MySpace, which seemed like it was here to stay in the early days of social media, was because Facebook was actually the cleaner, safer platform that regulated itself better. You weren't as besieged by, frankly, pornography, among other things, but trolling and violence too. And so it's interesting to see it as the cleaner one that now has so many problems itself, even as they work hard and have a lot of well-intentioned people trying to get at those problems. So I think what makes it seem like the current companies that have such a foothold are likely to maintain them is the fact that they are so large and they have such capital that other products that come along that could conceivably either carve out market share doing roughly what they do, or just take people into a different way of communicating, these big companies buy them they buy them and they either incorporate their designs into their existing products, or they continue to have a semi-independent existence, a branded existence, but we know who owns them. Think of WhatsApp being owned by Facebook, even YouTube being owned by Google. That was a number of years ago, but that was a big
Instagram by Facebook. I feel like there's still this cultural sense that Instagram is like the better platform, and it's like, no, it's still Facebook.
It's still the same. And, this is in a wide array of emerging technologies. So technologies about virtual reality, technologies that deploy AI, things that could change the way we all interact and engage online, not even just social media, but things that deserve new titles. They are largely being bought at even just a promising stage of development by companies that have extraordinary amounts of cash. And I am not an antitrust expert. I know there are a lot of strong views among the antitrust community about whether these should or shouldn't be allowed to continue. But if these sorts of purchases do continue, the idea that some other company will reach a point of really elbowing out the big ones as we know them for market share and remaining independent, it just seems less likely than it did when we used to think of a Silicon Valley where the next really hot thing, really sleekly designed product could make it big.
Right. I also wanted to ask you, and Bret, maybe I'll go to you for this one first, about scale from another perspective. So not just the sheer size of these companies and how cash rich they are, but the scale of audience. And one thing I've been thinking about is, often in the realm of thinking about moderation and how to tackle disinformation that's already there, but you could think about it just in larger, more philosophical terms too, is there a point at which a platform is too big to be good? Like, what was the magic number of users where Facebook was still like more good than bad, or Twitter or Google for that matter? And maybe that's not the right way to think about it, but I'm really curious, Bret, what you think. Like, how much is the scale the problem here?
I honestly don't know. It's a great question. I've never thought of it in those terms before. I mean, I've thought of it in terms of how sophisticated the platform becomes, and as they become better at prioritizing content and sort of making the user experience better, I think you have seen that, like, as you've moved in that direction, you've moved in the other direction in terms of the like health of the information environment on the platform. But I've never thought of it in terms of the user base as much as like the sophistication of the platform itself. Because, like, when I joined Facebook 2007, it kind of was what it still presents itself as being, where, it was a place I could connect with people from high school, and I was living overseas, and it really was just that sort of community environment. And then as it became more and more sophisticated, in many ways made the user experience, quote unquote, better in terms of giving you more options and more things you could do, I found the experience to get worse and worse and worse. And I don't know if those two are directly related, if it's also bringing in just like that was the political environment. But it's something I've noticed on other platforms, but I haven't thought of it in terms of the scale question before.
I want to go to foreign interference, just in the interest of time. And I'm curious, maybe Josh, I'll start with you, to hear about what you've noticed. I mean, I'm thinking about 2016, it seemed, at least from someone not inside of a large social platform or government, just as a journalist, that our sense of the level and breadth of interference in the 2016 election sort of seemed to drip out, to the point that over the course of a year, it was like, okay, wow, that was actually really bad, but we didn't have a full picture for a long time. What sense do we have now of what's happened this time around, and how much do you think we still have yet to learn? And also, if you could sort of describe the nature of the interference as we've seen it so far.
It's such a great reminder that we didn't, at this point in the 2016 cycle, have at all our arms around the extent of the foreign interference. Now, I do think we had a lot more and really sophisticated eyeballs watching, right? We had folks at various think tanks in the media monitoring this up to and during the election. So in a sense, I do expect us to know more faster. And we're seeing folks like Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab already begin to issue their reports on what they've seen. But it is an important reminder that we shouldn't expect the full scope of that until we can really sift through it. And I hope that the companies are themselves doing an after action the way we in government sometimes would do after actions to understand things better than in the moment that they were unfolding. Now, real quickly, what seems to have happened is it seems like a lot of the innovations that companies came up with after 2016 did at least change the nature of foreign interference. So accounts didn't build the massive followings that they once did. Paid advertising often got scrutinized because of new restrictions in ways that happened relatively little in 2016. But of course, bad actors adapt. That's what bad actors do. Instead of having fewer really large accounts, meaning with large followings, there were more accounts with smaller followings. And if they were disrupted, taken down, suspended, if particular content was removed, they rejuvenated because they anticipated having to rejuvenate, knowing that this was in some ways a different sort of cat and mouse game that had been in 2016. And then just most astonishingly, I don't know whether this gets even called foreign interference sometimes, but occasionally I will look at RT, used to be called Russia Today. I will look at other sources for what quotes are in their lead stories as they spin and try to polarize how they present the moment in American politics. And often I would just see a quote, an accurate quote from Donald Trump, from Bill Barr, from somebody high ranking in our government or somebody on the outside close to them. And I don't know if researchers tend to tally that as foreign election interference, an accurate quote of the US president and the US attorney general, but it is serving the same function this cycle. And it's probably more effective because it's coming from ultimately a source that's credible with many Americans.
It's very disturbing. I'm wondering too, if leading up to an election, if foreign interference is or any interference, I shouldn't limit this to foreign, I suppose. But if political bad actors are aiming to either influence the outcome of an election or sort of just like sow chaos generally, what has changed now that the election's outcome is clear? Like, is now obviously we're seeing this very robust effort to delegitimize the election outcomes and to say that there was fraud when there is no evidence of fraud. And to your point, we're seeing that from officials themselves. But do you see that the nature of disinformation attempts, either from inside or outside the US, changes now that the election is officially behind us?
Well, I would say the election results are clear to 65% of the country, and that's the real concern. And I think if you look back at what Russia honestly thought would happen in 2016 and their play there was getting ready for what we're seeing now. I mean, they thought Hillary Clinton would win too. And we saw sprinkled throughout their messaging. I mean, yes, there was an effort to denigrate Hillary Clinton and everything that has been well publicized. But throughout, there was this fraud narrative, which of course Trump was talking about in 2016 too, when we didn't have mail-in ballots and everything else. So I think they were prepping in 2016 for what's happening now. And we've seen that throughout 2020, starting with the Iowa caucuses, when there was that whole fiasco with the app malfunctioning. RT and Sputnik were running nonstop articles about what happened there and about sort of this, political behind the scenes hijinks and all of these efforts to manipulate results that the Democratic Party was polling internally, not even talking about the general election. So I think this has been built into the plan for a very long time. I don't think it's necessarily like now we are transitioning because we seem to have a clear result. So it's a different strategy. That's been a strategy of foreign and domestic. Obviously, Trump has been signaling this for months, but we saw, on election day at 7 a.m. in the morning when polls open in Philadelphia, it took about 10 minutes for the first video to appear in sort of the right-wing ecosystem, claiming voter fraud and voter suppression and poll workers not being allowed in. So what we're seeing now, I think we're seeing the plan in action. And I don't think that this is going to wrap up in the next week or two. And I frankly don't even think it's going to wrap up if Trump just decides he's going to concede. I don't really see that happening. But even if, the better angels sort of speak to him and he comes out on Friday and says, does an Al Gore and says, I disagree, but for the betterment of the country. I think it's sort of the horses out of the barn at this point. And I think the damage is going to be long lasting here because those narratives are just, they're really deep rooted at this point, and I don't think you can wind this back up. So I'm very, very concerned for not only how long this lasts and kind of the immediate, but for the long-term damage for every election that we see from here on out. I think this is just going to be a constant going forward.
Well, and there's obviously grave concern for the health of democracy, but then also because of this sort of that people aren't sharing aren't occupying shared sense of reality, the 65% you mentioned, there is this very real concern about how online disinformation spills out into offline life. And even I should say, I think that we overuse still that distinction when it doesn't really exist. But Josh, I'm curious for your thoughts on, I mean, we've been primed to worry about threats of violence related to sort of election chaos. What are you seeing and what are you most concerned about in terms of, you know, the direct line from disinformation to whether it's unlawful militias taking matters into their own hands, that kind of thing?
I'll start with one note of good news before I get gloomy again. But the good news was Election Day itself, which I think passed with limited incidents of armed intimidation, armed voter suppression, nothing I think we'd call coordinated violence. And we're at a point in the United States where we need to stop and appreciate that. It's maybe astonishing that we have to, but it's better in some ways than Election Day was expected to be. And so that's the good news. The bad news is the unlawful private militias across the country, their followers, those who share some ideological similarities, they, after Election Day, continue to consume a limited set of information, but really more disinformation that has led to an increasing insistence that the election results, as many of us believe them to clearly be, are illegitimate. To the extent they will end up being the results, they think that that's a rigged outcome or a stolen outcome in some way. And one thing I've been seeing in even just the first week after Election Day is an increasing narrative in the really extreme right circles online that the Republican Party can't be trusted to stand up for Donald Trump. In other words, they're laying the groundwork for saying, look, sure, there's some litigation happening, there's some statements being made in Trump's support, but we don't think the Republican Party is doing everything it can to, in their worldview, salvage this election for Donald Trump, which has begun to lead to the question of, well, what more should we as unlawful armed militias or individuals, what should we do? And if the answer becomes violence, that's a particularly dangerous place for the country to be. But I think it's just notable to see that separation, that wedge being driven in the rhetoric between this individual of Donald Trump, who has such an astonishing hold now on so many in this country, and even separating away the party apparatus if it doesn't do what these individuals and groups think it should be doing to press Trump's case.
Well, and it's very much the sort of QAnon contingency, this most deeply pro-Trump, anti-establishment, anti-institution, anti-reality group, I think. We're running out of time, sadly, but I want to hopefully end on a at least constructive note, because so much of this is so heavy. And I'm curious just briefly for both of your views on, for people who are wondering what they as individuals can do, whether it's they have family members who are conspiracy theorists, or they want to, encourage the health of democracy or put pressure on social platforms to be better, whatever it may be. What do you think the role is of the individual in fighting these many complicated overlapping forces that we're facing with regard to disinformation and extremism?
I mean, this is a little bit lame, but it's something that I kind of promote. It's like to take some responsibility over your own small community. Like individually, even those of us, I mean, it's my job to kind of counter disinformation. But if I look at it as fighting sort of the health of the information ecosystem, like I'm just going to give up and head to the bar kind of thing. Like it's hopeless. But if you're just, an average person out there who just sees like what their feed has become, and it is disheartening, to take ownership over your community, whether that's, your online kind of community or your friend group offline, and like do your part in improving kind of the health of discourse there, which is don't be responsible for spreading mis or disinformation, which most people obviously never think that they are doing that, but be careful and cross-check and understand that disinformation targets your biases. So like all of us are quite good at spotting disinformation when it's about the party or a cause that we do not support. We're quite bad when we want it to be true. And so people need a better understanding of that and not to kind of fall in the traps of like doing what the other side is doing. And then when you do have people in your family who are consistently spreading disinformation, like there are ways to engage that don't kind of further inflame tensions. So calling them out openly on social media and calling them an idiot and like getting into this sort of escalating rhetoric and conflict is not obviously helpful. But there are ways of kind of, if you think these people are still salvageable, I mean, some, if they're way off the deep end, it's lost cause, but directing them to appropriate sources. I mean, I did that with a family member this week who was spreading something about more voters in Wisconsin voting than were actually registered. And I was able to point them to sources saying, look, that was taking data from 7 days before the election. You can register up to the day of the election, just kind of walk people through. So I think shrinking down this huge problem into your own smaller circle and tackling it there, it's just kind of easier to approach it that way, because otherwise it does seem insurmountable.
I don't think that's lame at all. I think it's very good advice. Josh, in our last minute, anything to add?
That is a great set of advice from Bret. And all I will add to it, maybe moving even one step away from the digital platforms themselves, is have awkward political conversations in this country. For a while, we said the opposite because they were so awkward and so uncomfortable that we said giving and not talk about it. But we're at a point where the information silos are so extreme and they're leading to such differing senses of what reality is. We have to do the opposite. We have to have the awkward and the uncomfortable conversations, not just about particular content, though I think that's critical with what Bret's emphasizing, but also about basic ideologies and visions of this country and what a participatory democracy should look like. That's
great. So be good to each other in your communities, be a force for good, and learn how to disagree with one another again. I think those are all really important points. Thank you both so much for coming today. And thank you all to those of you who have joined us. And special thanks especially to the Global Security Forum for having us. This has been fascinating, and really appreciate everyone's time.